I bought this camera 3 years ago with a dream. I was just a photographer who was interested in doing video. I had the Sony A7C, I had shot a couple wedding films, but I wanted a dedicated video camera. I was close to picking up the A7S III, but then Sony announced this camera. Just to make it clear before we really dive into talking about this camera, I am a photographer first. That's where my heart and my passion lies. Most of the videos I do film with this camera are about photography. I don't consider myself a videographer or filmmaker, even though I guess I technically am. That stuff just doesn't really interest me, which is pretty ironic considering I make YouTube videos. So I am a photographer first, I always have, and I always will be. But when I saw Sony announce the FX3, I quickly fell in love with the very unique body design of this camera and the audio XLR handle attached directly to the camera that you don't need a cage for, which has got to be one of my favorite parts of this camera. And I don't think I even realized when I bought this camera just how much I would love and appreciate the XLR grip. I use it to manage all of my audio, whether it's a shotgun mic or my DJI mic as well. Now back to the actual FX3. This camera is by no means cheap. Especially when I bought it, it was actually very hard to get your hands on one, and most people were actually paying above retail price for it. So it was definitely a lot of money to invest in my YouTube channel, especially at a time when I was not making any money off of my videos. But I knew I wanted a camera that would stand the test of time and not become obsolete overnight. So when I bought this camera, I wanted a camera that I knew would last the next 5 or maybe even 10 years without feeling that pressure to upgrade to the next big thing. And I'm glad I chose this camera because it is literally just that good at what it does. Now, at the time that I bought this camera, the FX30 and the ZV-E1 did not exist, and who knows, maybe if they had existed, I would have chosen one of those cameras instead. But almost 3 years later, I do not regret buying this camera, and one day when the FX3 Mark II was announced, I probably will not feel that pressure to upgrade, and I will continue to be happy with this camera. It also really helps that Sony is still updating the firmware to this day, like we're getting shutter angle finally later this year. Now, shutter angle isn't really a big deal to me necessarily, but stuff like focus breathing compensation definitely is. Of course, there are things I wish this camera did have, like internal NDs, but then that would come at the cost of this camera probably being double the size. And if I really wanted internal NDs, then I could just go buy an FX6. Although looking back, if I had gone with an FX6 at the time that I bought this camera, that would have been an even more irresponsible decision. Now, I know a lot of people are upset that it did take 3 years to even get shutter angle on this camera, and technically we don't even have it just yet. It's coming later this year. And I'll be honest, so feel free to disagree with me. When I am researching what camera I want to buy, I am basing it off of the current specs, so the current hardware and software. I'm not necessarily expecting Sony to upgrade it later on, because Sony doesn't technically owe us any of that. They could easily just put the new software in the new hardware. But here we are 3 years later and they have not released an FX3 Mark II, and they are still updating this camera because, like I mentioned earlier, it's just that good. And for that, I really appreciate it. It's nice that Sony is actually listening and still giving us these updates. Now, of course, the first big update that this camera got is when Sony announced that it was getting Cine AI. Personally, I don't really use Cine AI. I used it a little bit at the beginning, but then I ended up just switching back to the flexible ISO mode, which is basically just the equivalent of using the original firmware that the FX3 had, so PP8 S-Log3, except it's just called flexible ISO and it's in log shooting and not a technical picture profile. But the reason I ended up going back was because I enjoyed using auto white balance. Because I film a lot of run and gun videos, so photo walks outside and lighting that is constantly changing, so I was not used to a set white balance. Recently that has changed. I've gone from using auto white balance back to a set white balance, but I guess that just kind of comes with growing as a videographer or filmmaker. Personally, for me, the biggest selling point of this camera, so whenever someone asks me if I like my FX3 or if I would recommend it, I always bring up the dual native ISO. Being able to use 12,800 ISO with very minimal noise. Don't let people tell you that there is no noise, because there's definitely still noise, more noise than if you're shooting at ISO 640 or 800, but it is still very usable, and it's actually crazy some of the results that you can get, because the main lens that I use is the 24-105, which is an f4 aperture, But there are times when I'm using the 12,800 ISO at night and I still need to use an ND filter, which is just kind of crazy to think of having to use an ND filter at night. So it is truly a game changer. Now, I'm not the kind of person that will go straight from 640 to 12,800. I will increasingly bump up my ISO, but once I get to about 3,200, if I start going beyond 3,200, that's when I go straight to 12,800. A fair warning to anyone who decides to buy this camera and you have access to that dual native ISO of 12,800, it's really hard to go back to anything else. Other than that, I could praise every other aspect of this camera, but at that point I would just be talking about the same stuff that everyone else has been talking about this camera for the past 3 years. So let's talk about what I dislike about this camera. I'll preface this by saying I've used this camera for pretty much everything that you can possibly think of in the 3 years that I've owned it. So YouTube videos, commercial work, filming weddings, real estate, and the list goes on. And even then, my complaints are still pretty minor. But I hate to say it, but my FX3 suffers from the dreaded interference, like buzzing noise coming from the audio jack. So if I'm using my DJI mic and I don't have it connected straight to the XLR handle, but directly into the audio jack on the side, and I just have my DJI mic sitting in the hot shoe mount, but it is impossible to get rid of that noise without elevating the receiver of the mic from the actual camera body. And the only way I have found to try and get rid of that, which it doesn't even do it 100%, you can buy these little adapter things that attach onto your 3.5 millimeter cord. And even then, it still doesn't really help very much. But it isn't the end of the world because I can just plug my microphone directly into the XLR handle, and I do enjoy using the XLR handle most of the time anyways, so I probably would be doing this regardless, and it's much easier to just use this to control your gain and your audio levels anyways. Which leads into the second thing that I wish Sony would have done a little bit differently, but it's not that big of a deal because you can fix it with third-party accessories, is the grip for the actual audio handle is very shallow. It doesn't give you very much grip for being a grip, if that makes sense. So I had to buy a small rig extension, which fixes that problem almost completely. And my third concern, which is also directly related to the XLR handle, is that it feels like it's made of a very cheap plastic. I've seen a lot of people mention online that they have broken their XLR handle just by their camera taking a small fall or just packing their camera the wrong way in their bag. So I've tried to be very careful. This camera has definitely taken a couple falls since I bought it, and luckily the handle has not broken, but it is something that I try and be very careful and wary of. So my hope is that one day when Sony decides to make an FX3 Mark II is that they improve the XLR handle, just make it a little bit more durable, and make it compatible with the original FX3. I'm sitting here struggling to think of anything I actually dislike about this camera. So as a photographer turned videographer and YouTuber who wanted a dedicated video camera, it's safe to say even after 3 years, this camera has not let me down and I still do not regret my purchase. So even though I've had this camera for almost 3 years and it's been out for over 3 years, I have no doubt in my mind that it will last me another 5 or maybe even 10 years. 10 years could be pushing it a little bit, but I have no doubt that I will still be using this camera, and for anyone else looking for a sustainable video camera for their videos that will last for many years to come, you can't go wrong with the FX3. And I think one day when the FX3 Mark II is announced, it will just make this camera even more of a no-brainer because chances are the prices will go down even more. Of course, it would be nice to have AI autofocus, which most newer Sony cameras do have, but the autofocus from this camera is still more than good enough. I know I don't actually need that stuff, and I'm happy knowing I bought a camera that I will be using for a very, very long time. So thanks for watching the video, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to help support the channel, and I hope I can inspire you guys to get out and take more photos and shoot more videos. Go out and shoot.